I wanted to tell you about when I was 6 years old, and I spent the weekend with my Aunt Evelyn. Now, before that, I had mostly seen Aunt Evelyn at Christmas. She was a red-haired, middle-aged woman who laughed a lot and stuck the plastic gift-wrapping bows to the top of her head. I'd sat in her lap, and she pretended like her legs were the agitator in a washing machine, and I was a pile of clothes. "Get ready for the spin cycle, Sugar Pop," she'd shout. She was, in short, fun. So there I was, my suitcase packed for a weekend with her in a little house crammed into the valley at the base of converging hills deep in rural Indiana. The rain was just beginning when my parents dropped me off that evening, and I could hear the rumble of thunder in the distance. Aunt Evelyn's house had everything. An endless supply of sugar-laden breakfast cereals, which she cheerfully fed me for dinner, along with Pop-Tarts and cookies. Pictures of Elvis and Jesus painted on black velvet that glowed when lit with the attached black lights. Stacks of old china shoved into every corner, and which she encouraged me to use for playing everything from restaurant to Frisbee. A collection of record albums included one called The World's Greatest Marches, and wearing robes and carrying large wooden spoons, Aunt Evelyn and I marched around her overstuffed living room. After we had finally fallen breathless onto the squeaky sofa, I asked her why she had so many things. "Because, Sugar Pop," she said, leaning in and looking deep into my eyes, "you never know when doomsday is coming." This should have been my first clue, but I was only 6. By the time I went to bed, the rain was pouring and thunder and lightning crashed and crackled across the night sky, but it was far past my normal bedtime, and I was too tired to care. A few hours later, though it seemed like minutes, Aunt Evelyn woke me. Shaking me, she shouted, "Get up! It's never going to stop!" She took me to the window, and there, by the light of the moon, she pointed to the base of the rain-slicked hills that surrounded us. "See," she said, "the water is getting higher and higher and will be washed away before you know it." Other than the expected puddles, I couldn't see anything threatening. "We're doomed, Sugar Pop," she said, her voice hopeless and her eyes now full of tears. I tried to comfort her as best I could, but nothing I said seemed to get through. Over and over, she kept saying, "I knew this day would come." I knew this day would come. What struck me, even then, at 6, was that despite the outwardly carefree personality she exuded, underneath there had clearly always been the certainty that something bad, something devastating that would crush all happiness was going to happen. It was something that she had been waiting for. Now, it's really no big surprise that it would be a flood that would be one of Aunt Evelyn's greatest fears. After all, the flood myth is one historically found in many cultures, whether it's Noah's Ark, the Tanu story, or the Epic of Gilgamesh. Common to these stories is the theme that a great flood is sent by a deity or deities to crush civilization as an act of divine retribution. Now, knowing my Aunt Evelyn and her relationship to a small fundamentalist sect of Christianity, I have no doubt that she believed that night that the wrath of God was coming down to punish us all. When I think of all that natural energy she had just bubbling out of her, I mourn the loss of the emotional and physical energy wasted on waiting for that flood. Energy she could have spent doing other things. As Unitarian Universalists, we generally think of ourselves as above or beyond that kind of preoccupation. Divine retribution is something that we don't hold with, and our relationship with nature and science offers us far more practical ways of understanding a heavy rainstorm. But a little bit of my Aunt Evelyn too often lives in all of us. The flood story is found in multiple cultures because there is something primal about it, something archetypal, something we respond to surrounding the possibility of our own destruction in much the same way that we flock to disaster films. How often do we find ourselves waiting for something awful to happen? How often do we get preoccupied with looking at the worst-case scenario of a situation? Now, I'm not talking about contingency planning. I know lots of people here define themselves as rational thinkers, and I'd argue that having a plan ready for a worst-case possibility is an optimistic action because it's indicative of knowing that a a terrible occurrence can be, well, if not overcome, it can be managed to some degree. The recent tsunami in Japan is an all too real reminder that sometimes true, unmanageable catastrophe does happen. In this case, it took the form of a great flood, and as horrible as it was, I would still say that no good would have come from a fearful, superstitious anticipation of this event. A country full of Aunt Evelyns would have been no more prepared for such a tragedy than my aunt was the night of the big storm. It left her paralyzed, sitting in a chair crying while a 6-year-old child tried to comfort her well into the wee hours of the morning. That's the problem with waiting around for something bad to happen. It doesn't actually prepare us to deal with that bad thing if it should happen. Our imaginations can always conjure up something so bad that the idea of being able to work against it seems futile and hopeless. And that very kind of thinking is anti-Unitarian Universalist, because we are, at our heart, optimists. Okay. Let's first get some realities surrounding the word optimism out of the way. We know that optimism gets a bad rap sometimes, and maybe it's deserved to some degree. After all, the old saying goes, don't be too optimistic. The light at the end of the tunnel may be another train. I guess that's why optimists have been the butt of jokes forever. Things like, how many optimists does it take to screw in a light bulb? None. They're convinced that the power will come back on soon. That sums up how many perceive optimists. People always looking for the silver lining, but blind to the practical realities at hand. And that is just the kind of optimist that we as Unitarian Universalists are not. First off, we know that scientific realities have shown that optimists are happier, more successful, and live longer than pessimists. More than that, though, we know that we, as laid out in our very principles, are an optimistic people, for we believe that the potential for goodness pervades reality. Otherwise, why would we bother worrying about the dignity of every person or the interdependent web of existence? If we weren't optimists, we'd feel the world was a hopeless place, not worthy of or capable of changing for the better. We subscribe to the words of William King, who said, "Believe that life is worth living, and our belief will help create that fact." We have optimism built into our faith, for we believe we can effect change. And history has proven us correct again and again, whether it was Susan B. Anthony fighting for women's rights, or Thomas Starr King reaffirming California as part of the United States. And it's not just the big names, of course, it's all the people who contributed over the years, whether it was marching for racial equality, or phone banking here at this church against Proposition 8, or protesting in Arizona. We believe we can effect change because we've done it. Our successes aren't always immediate, but we've learned to see the small victories along the way as their precursor for larger change. And that makes us optimists. Not foolish optimists, but realistic, practical optimists. We look to the bright side because we know there is one. Now, not too long ago, I was watching a series of videos on the internet that had been filmed by a same-sex couple in Northern California. They were raising 2 adopted children, and their stated purpose in sharing these videos about their family was simply to convey the idea that they were a normal family like any other. I was charmed by the candid glimpse into their lives and showed the videos to a non-UU friend. His response was telling. "That's admirable," he said, "but there's really no point. They're not going to change anyone's mind." That's pessimism. The belief that humanity tends toward bad. So why bother even trying? We embrace optimism because we know there is a point in trying. All of us sitting here know that those videos have the chance of changing someone's mind, of opening someone's heart. We as Unitarian Universalists know that it is worth it to maintain an optimistic attitude because it keeps us acting. I remember 11 years ago when Proposition 22 threatened to restrict marriages to opposite-sex couples. I printed off an 8.5 by 11-inch "No on Prop 22" sign from the internet and put it on the garage of my parents' house where I lived at the time. Now, I debated with myself whether it would matter, but I felt I had to do something. I was amazed when a couple who lived just a few doors down were walking by and revealed to me that simply seeing that sign on our garage door had changed how they planned on voting. It was such a small thing I had done, the size of a standard piece of paper, but it had actually yielded results. Now, all of us could name similar examples from our own lives. We know from experience that it's worth putting ourselves out there and taking action because we might change something for the better. That's what real, practical optimism is all about. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't gripe and grumble about things. And maybe some of us could work on projecting that optimism outwardly a little more sometimes. I won't name any names. But the very fact that we are here shows that we do believe there is something that we as a community can do to make this world a better place. When we get into committee meetings that go on too long, and they do sometimes, when we disagree about this or that, when we have the inevitable uncomfortable or awkward moment with someone here who we have trouble connecting with, we have to learn to brush off that momentary negativity and remember that at our core, one of the things that binds us together is that we are an optimistic people. Shall I jump up and down while I say it? We are an optimistic people. Okay, you won't forget that now, right? The things I do for you.